Before the Dominion can turn you into a ghost, it has to make sure there's nothing left that will argue with the orders. They don't start with implants or cloaking rigs. They start with erasure, records retired, names dimmed out of registries. Whatever life you had before folded into an archive no one is meant to open. Then they feed what's left of you to things they barely understand themselves. Protoss relics that remember other skies. Zerg hives bottled in glass. Machines that measure how much of that noise your mind can absorb before it cracks. Somewhere inside that process, if you survive it, you stop being a citizen and become a tool with a call sign. On Theta 9, that was the entire point. The shuttle ride up was the last time I traveled under my real name. The shuttle shook in short, nervous bursts, a vibration that climbed up through the seat frame and into my teeth. Recycled air pressed flat against the back of my throat, tinny with metal dust and the faint, sour tang of too many bodies breathing too long. Out the narrow viewport, the planet rolled slowly underneath us. A scabbed disk of brown storms and faint violet scars where the Zerg had kissed the surface and not quite finished the job. They'd told us we were the lucky ones. We sat 4 to a row in the conscript block, webbing tight across our chests. Standard Dominion gray, unarmored, our old clothes taken back on the surface. No names on the chest, just a stenciled number, white on gray, already starting to crack at the edges where the fabric creased. A Marine drill sergeant rode out the turbulence like it was nothing. One glove hooked casually on the overhead rail. Black combat armor, scar on his jaw, eyes that slid over us and didn't stick to anyone in particular. He didn't need to pace or bellow. The engines did that for him. The shuttle's speakers crackled once near the beginning of the ascent, and his voice rolled through the cabin, clipped and calm, telling us we were candidates now, that if we made it through Theta 9 we got a new life, and if we didn't, we went back to the meat grinder. Either way, the Dominion won. After that, I remember mostly noise and pressure and the way my hands kept wanting to close around a rifle that wasn't there. They had pulled me off the frontier world 2 weeks after the Zerg hit our settlement. I'd still had dirt under my nails and ash in my hair when the psionics officer made me stare at a spinning glyph on a datapad until the edges of my vision blurred and the floor seemed to heave under my boots. They liked what the gauges said. Tests well, someone had noted on a slate without looking up, as if they were describing a piece of equipment instead of a person. Above the planet, Theta 9 waited like a ring of teeth. The station's docking spine rotated slowly, studded with hardpoints and shuttle clamps. Armored plates gleamed dull red where re-entry heat had scorched past arrivals. As we slid into the bay, I saw the Dominion emblem painted huge across the far bulkhead, the familiar eagle abstracted into a pair of black wings spread over the docking gates. It looked less like protection and more like a shadow that had forgotten its owner. When the maglocks caught, the shuttle's vibration dwindled to a low skeletal hum. The hatch cycled open with a hiss of pressure equalization and the smell of cold air, different from the planet, sharper, scrubbed. It was the smell of somewhere that had never been exposed to real wind. We disembarked in file, boots clanging on the metal ramp. The docking bay was high and cavernous, ceiling lost in a haze of light and exhaust. Cargo crates were stacked in stiff geometric towers. A pair of Goliath frames stood dormant near the far wall, legs locked, torso weapons folded inward like sleeping insects. Above us, behind armored glass, silhouettes watched from a control booth, heads turning in slow, disinterested arcs as the next load of bodies came in. They walked us through corridors that all looked the same on the first pass. Bulkheads painted a non-color between gray and green, floor grates polished smooth in the center by years of traffic, red hazards striping at regular intervals. Pipes and cabling ran overhead in disciplined bundles, labeled in neat stencil fonts. No posters, no graffiti, no attempt at making it feel like anything but a machine we were passing through. Intake processing was a hangar in miniature. Rows of partitioned booths, glowing scanners, and lines of conscripts that moved in jittering fits and starts. The noise flattened into a constant murmur, broken by the occasional barked order. The chime of a completed scan, the wet cough of someone who hadn't shaken planetary dust from their lungs yet. At the first station, they took blood. At the second, retinal prints. At the third, history. A clerk in Dominion blue sat behind a holoslate, eyes slightly unfocused in the way they get when the data feed is more real than the room. He asked questions in a practiced cadence. Name, colony designation, unit assignment during the attack, surviving relatives, and my answers stacked themselves into lines of light. As I spoke, the text bloomed, then shifted and compressed as the system cross-referenced, corrected, and filed. My settlement's name appeared only long enough to be marked as destroyed. The clerk murmured the reclassification more to himself than to me, logging it as a biological hazard asset before flicking it away into some archive I'd never see. He reached the final field. Name. I gave it to him. It felt strange in my mouth, like a word from a language I was already forgetting. The holo paused while the system thought about it. Then the name dimmed and slid sideways on the display, replaced by a string of alphanumeric glyphs that were shorter, easier to scan, easier to sort. Candidate designation G417, the clerk read out, more for the record than for me. His gaze brushed my face, then drifted back to the holo. Memorize it. Something inside me twitched, an animal flinch I kept from reaching my muscles. I started to ask what would happen to the name I'd just surrendered, but he tapped a control before the question fully formed. My old name vanished from the visible screen, folding into encrypted sub-menus and archival tags that might as well have been deep space. The clerk noted that the record was now sealed under psionic operations and that my prior identity had been retired from active Dominion use. Retired like obsolete equipment. I signed without reading. My stylus stroke produced a jagged, unfamiliar mark on the holo. It didn't matter. The system didn't need my consent. It had my blood and my eyes and a war that needed more precise weapons. They gave me a thin, matte black wristband with the new designation etched into it and sent me on to the next station, where a medtech checked the fit of a neural interface patch behind my ear. The metal was cold against my skin. For a second, as the contact points kissed bone, I thought I heard a faint whisper, like distant radio chatter bleeding through a bad channel, but the sound resolved into the ordinary buzz of the intake hall. Nerves, I told myself. ghost stories we told each other on the surface about the Emperor's pet killers, echoing in my skull. When they marched us out toward the barracks, I glanced back just once. The intake hall was already filling with the next wave of bodies, shuttles cycling in, clamps closing, the machine of Theta 9 turning without a hitch. On a wall-mounted screen above the booths, a roster scrolled in crisp white letters. Names on the left, designations on the right. As I watched, my own line flickered, my name dimming, then dropping off entirely. The designation remained. G417, neat, legible, replaceable. I didn't hear my name again for a very long time. The barracks smelled of chemical detergent and tired bodies, a flat, sour heat trapped under the vents. Air flowed constantly through grated ducts in the ceiling, but it never quite kept up with the number of people breathing, sweating, and shedding skin into that recycled loop. They had stacked us 3 bunks high along each wall. Metal frames, thin mattresses, numbered plates where names might have gone in a different life. My bunk marker read G417 in the same crisp font as the intake slate. The numbers followed me now, on my wrist, on my bed, flickering at the corner of my vision on every door I passed through. We had been there 3 days when my hand stopped reaching automatically for the space on my chest where a name patch should have been. The routine settled over us fast, a net cast and drawn tight. Wake to the barracks lights slamming on at cycle start. Form up in the corridor for head count. The scanner at the door quietly pinging each wristband as we filed past. Nutrient trays in the mess, gray and efficient. Conditioning lectures in a tiered hall where the ghost instructors stood in the shadows and the holodisplays did the talking. They taught us to shoot and move. But those drills felt almost familiar. Echoes of Marine training some of us had already seen. It was everything wrapped around the training that felt wrong. In the mess, the screens never showed entertainment feeds or news from home. Instead, they looped tactical footage. Zerg rushing fortified lines in waves of carapace and claws. Protoss warriors cutting through Marine fire with unnerving grace. Psi blades leaving bright afterimages in the ruins. The voiceovers stripped the battles down to data points and response profiles. Losses were just curves on a chart. At first I tried to study the footage, thinking that if I understood the angles and timings I might understand what they wanted from us. After the second cycle I realized understanding wasn't the point. Saturation was. The images sank in whether we wanted them or not, grinding away whatever else we used to see when we closed our eyes. Every evening, before lights out, a medtech came down the barracks row with a tray of small, clear plastic cups. 2 capsules each, matte blue, no markings. We lined up, held out our hands, swallowed under observation. Someone near the back asked what they were. The answer, stabilizers, prep for the interface, was given once, flatly, and that was apparently enough. After that, the cups just kept coming. By the second dose, my dreams lost their edges. I still slept, but I woke with only a texture, a sense of thick, dark resistance, like trying to remember something heard underwater. On the 5th cycle, my wristband pulsed amber during mess. G417, report to Admin 3. The corridor to Admin felt narrower than the others, even though the dimensions were the same. The doors were thicker, with more locks. Admin 3 itself was a small office with no viewports, just wall screens showing station schematics and traffic flows, all motion and color without context. A woman in Dominion blue sat at the central console, fingers moving through a layered hollow interface. She didn't offer me a seat. My designation pinged in her display, and my intake file unfolded into neat, color-coded lines. Colony records, loss statistics, aptitude curves. She reviewed my case the way someone checks a shipment. Certain values satisfied her. Others were dismissed as expected waste. As she spoke through the authority language, by order of psionic operations, by directive of Security Council, fields on her screens flickered and went gray. My civilian records slid into restricted archives. Old muster rolls, tax ledgers, conscript lists updated in real time on side panels. My name blinking out of them one after another. In the top corner, my birth name remained for a moment in smaller font, surrounded by tags and cross-references. She confirmed that it was now filed under an archive glyph instead of a living record, that any future queries would be rerouted to dead data. In the event I survived Theta 9, she said, I would eventually be assigned a call sign. Until then, the station and every system attached to it would recognize only G417. On some distant frontier terminal, if anyone bothered to search, my name would return nothing but a stale error or a flag that no one would have clearance to open. She asked if I had questions. The correct answer was that I did not. I thought of my settlement and the few people who might still be alive there, of hands trying to pull up a registry one day and finding a blank. I swallowed the thought and said nothing. The file closed. For the station, the conversation was over, and so was the person attached to that older set of lines. Back in the barracks, my bunk had already been updated. The small data strip at the head of the bed no longer held the faint sublayer where my old name had lived in the system's margins. Just the designation, bright and clean, as if it had always been that way. The others didn't ask what admin had wanted. They had their own summons, their own small erasures pending. That night, lying on my back beneath the upper bunk, the ceiling vents whispered softly, pushing air in a steady, measured rhythm. I tried to recall the sound of wind in the scrub trees outside our old hab modules, the crack of rifle fire over the ravine when the Zerg first came, the way the sky had looked when the dropships burned through it. The memories rose and then slid sideways, edges smudged by something chemical and deliberate. The capsules, I realized, were doing more than steadying us for implants. They were pruning us, sanding off anything that might snag on what came next. Lights Out hit with a sharp click, plunging the barracks into darkness broken only by the faint green line of an emergency strip near the floor. Somewhere down the row, a bunk frame creaked as someone shifted restless weight. A voice from the upper rack above me tested my designation in a whisper, just low enough not to trip the audio monitors, and then fell silent when I didn't answer. Forming words felt like swimming upstream. Eventually, the numbers on my wrist blurred, and cycle fatigue dragged me under. In the twisted half-dream that followed, I saw the intake hall again. This time, the roster screen didn't just dim and drop names off the list. The letters ran like fluid, slipping down off the display into a seething mass beneath it. Names twisted into chitinous shapes and pale tendrils that reached for the ceiling, writing themselves into something alive and hungry. Designations hovered above, clean and untouched, while the old identities sank and were digested. When I jerked awake, heart pounding, the barracks was quiet. The vents whispered on, steady and indifferent, as if they'd been humming along that same rhythm long before any of us arrived, and would continue long after our bunk plates belonged to someone else. They woke us before station dawn, when the corridor lights were still dimmed to a softer blue, and the air felt colder against bare skin. My breath fogged faintly as I swung my legs out of the bunk. The climate controls always dipped the temperature before major procedures, as if the station wanted us fully conscious for what it was about to do. Med team tags pulsed on my wristband, a soft amber glow. G417, implant sequence scheduled. Report to surgical deck 2. The walk there felt longer than it probably was. Theta 9's layout folded back on itself, decks connected by narrow lifts and ribbed corridors that offered no external views. It was easy to forget we were in orbit at all. The only hints came from the faint, cyclical tug in the gut when the station adjusted spin, and from the occasional tremor underfoot as docking clamps cycled somewhere far away. Surgical Deck 2 broke that pattern. The waiting area outside the implant theater had a viewport, small, thick, slanted, but a viewport all the same. Through it, the planet hung below us, mottled clouds drifting over dark land masses carved by old impact craters and newer Zerg growths, their violet stains veining out from landing scars like bruises. A line of candidates sat along the wall, gowns tied at the back, bare feet resting on the cold deck. Our uniforms had been taken at the door, folded and tagged for return or redistribution, depending on how the procedures went. No one said that part out loud. The absence of spare bunks had already taught us the math. Medtechs moved between us with slates and injectors. A nurse pressed a small device to the inside of my arm. Cold hissed through muscle and into bone. My heartbeat slowed, but my thoughts seemed to sharpen, each detail clicking into place with unnatural clarity. The stabilizers had smoothed the way. This was something else, narrowing the mind without numbing it. When my designation was called, I stood because my body knew it was supposed to. The implant suite better matched how I had imagined the inside of a ghost program. Brighter, almost sterile white instead of barracks gray, every edge precise. Overhead, articulated arms ended in tools and sensor clusters, hanging dormant like folded limbs of some mechanical organism waiting for a signal. The central table was narrow and bare, lined with restraints coiled neatly at its sides. A man in a surgical coat checked me against a slate, lips moving around the list of hardware slated for my spine and skull: neural suppressor, psi-amp interface, cortical filter. Standard sequence for a mind that had tested like mine. He spoke in a measured tone that treated the additions like components in a familiar machine. I lay back when he indicated, the restraints curling over wrists and ankles with a quiet mechanical whine. The padding was soft on the inside, almost considerate. The table's surface cooled against my spine as sensors mapped nerve responses, breathing patterns, micro-tremors. Overhead, a cluster of emitter rods descended, bathing my vision in pale bluish glare. Pressure gathered at the base of my skull as something metallic aligned with vertebrae, contact points testing bone and calculating angles. For a heartbeat, I considered tensing, twisting, making the restraints prove they were more than symbolic. The thought came and went with the same detachment as any other observation. The stabilizers, and whatever they had injected on the way in, had already filed the edges off that kind of impulse. Resistance, if it showed up anywhere, would just become another number in some behavior profile. So I stared at the ceiling instead. One panel near a seam had hairline cracks, tiny spiderweb fractures where something heavy had once hit. They'd patched it, but not repainted. The imperfection anchored me as the cold spread up my spine and pooled at the base of my skull. The pressure built, not sharp, but inexorable, like a hand pressing gently down on the surface of my thoughts. My awareness narrowed, not in the comforting way of focusing on a task, but like being funneled through a shrinking aperture while something large watched from the other side. Sound receded, the hum of machines, the hiss of circulated air, the faint rustle of cloth around the medical staff. All of it stepped back a few paces, leaving me alone in a white tunnel with the beat of my heart. Then, like someone tuning too fast through distant radio channels, impressions flickered at the edges of perception. Heat on bare skin that wasn't mine. The weight of armor that was too smooth and integrated, resting against limbs shaped differently. A horizon of canted stone, lit by twin moons hanging low and heavy in a sky that felt charged. The image snapped away before I could wrap language around it, leaving an aftertaste of cold metal and distant thunder. In its place came a thicker, denser sensation. Wet earth under clawed feet, the drag of viscous, humid air scented with copper and ammonia. A rumbling chorus, not heard but felt, pressed against the walls of my skull like many voices testing the strength of glass. The machines changed pitch. A nurse adjusted a dial out of my line of sight. The pressure inside my head tightened, narrowing the channel, dimming the foreign sensations until they shrank to a faint background throb. Somewhere near my ear, the surgeon's voice noted cross-channel bleed at a level that matched my aptitude, saying the filters would take. In that moment, I understood that the flashes weren't dreams. Somewhere on Theta 9, in a lab or vault I hadn't seen, there were Protoss artifacts pulsing with stored impressions and Zerg biomass humming with hive signal. The implants they were threading into my nervous system were bridges, and bridges did not care which direction traffic wanted to flow. Time dissolved into increments of pressure and release, heat and chill. The hairline cracks in the ceiling became constellations I traced with my eyes while the program wrote itself into bone and nerve. Eventually, the weight inside my skull settled into something steady. A new presence seated against the spine, humming faintly like a distant engine left idling. Restraints loosened at my wrists and ankles. When I sat up, the world lagged by a fraction of a second, as if my awareness and my body had slipped slightly out of alignment and were still negotiating terms. They checked my pupils with a light, logged my responses, noted that if non-Terran sensory overlays persisted, I was to report them for calibration. The instructions treated alien visions as both side effect and asset. The recovery ward was a long, low room lined with beds and monitoring rigs. Candidates lay in various stages of post-procedure haze, eyes half open, fingers twitching as nervous systems learned their new circuitry. An orderly guided me to a vacant bed near the middle of the row and secured loose restraints around my wrists more out of habit than necessity. He told me to sleep if I could, that there would be an evaluation after a cycle and a half. I drifted without quite slipping under. Thoughts fluttered between my home settlement, the intake hall, the hairline cracks in the ceiling. Once I felt that thick, many-voiced presence press gently against the fresh edges inside my skull, like a tide testing a seawall, and then retreat when it found the filters holding. When I opened my eyes again, the bed to my left was empty. The monitoring rig still stood beside it, cables neatly coiled. The restraints lay open on the mattress. A faint smear of dried antiseptic traced the sheet where a shoulder had rested. No personal effects, no folded uniform at the foot. I was sure someone had been there when they strapped me in, a broad-shouldered candidate who'd made a low joke in the waiting area about upgrades. I tried to recall his designation and met only blank static where the numbers should have been, as if the memory had been cut along with whatever outcome his file now carried. The orderly passed by, pushing a cart of fresh IV bags. I asked what had happened to the candidate who'd occupied the empty bed. He didn't bother to glance at it. My implant readout interested him more. Procedure outcomes, he said, were confidential. I should focus on my own recovery. His tone wasn't unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was neutral. The empty space beside me registered as a completed operation, nothing more. Later, they wheeled in a fresh mattress, stripped and clean, ready for the next body. Somewhere in the station's data core, a file had just been labeled with an outcome that no longer required bunk space, stabilizer doses, or barracks air. Theta 9 made room, as it always did. Lying there, feeling the faint alien hum at the base of my skull, I understood that this was how the Ghost program advanced. Incrementally, methodically, one vanished candidate at a time, until the cost blurred into the background noise of a system operating within acceptable parameters. And I, G417, was now one of its functioning parts. The psionic test chamber smelled of ozone and old sweat baked into foam padding. The air felt too dry, the way it gets after electricity has been running through it for hours. My wrists fit neatly into the molded rests of the chair. Someone had designed it for average Terran measurements, and I had obligingly grown close enough to standard. Thick cabling ran from the back of the chair up into the ceiling, bundled black cords disappearing into the grid of reinforced panels. Directly in front of me, the far wall was a blank matte projection surface framed by sensor arrays. To my right, behind a seam of polarized glass, the control booth glowed faintly, moving silhouettes, hovering hollows, our vitals scrolling past in colors that meant more to them than our faces did. They had lined 3 of us up, chairs bolted to the floor in a shallow arc. I recognized the candidate 2 seats over by posture more than face, G. 422, narrow-shouldered, fingers that never quite stopped tapping patterns into his bunk frame. Between us sat a third candidate I only half knew, designation already crowding out anything else. A tech leaned over me, adjusting the cap that hugged my skull. Conductive nodes pressed against shaved scalp in a tight ring, each one whispering faint static into the implant socket at the base of my neck. The weight there had become familiar over the last cycles, a constant presence like an extra bone. Overhead speakers clicked. The lead evaluator's voice came through filtered and flat, nowhere and everywhere at once. He recited the protocol. 3 stages starting with baseline projection, then exposure to controlled artifact stimulus, ending with cross-channel resilience testing. It sounded like assembly instructions for a machine. Baseline projection meant making small things happen. We'd practiced in shielded cubicles, nudging a training drone a few centimeters along its track, pushing a gyro-stabilized round just enough to make a miss. It was clumsy, tiring work, like trying to move objects at the bottom of a pool without using your hands. The wall in front of me flickered. Target silhouettes bloomed in pale orange across a simulated battlefield. Marine armor, zerglings, the angular outline of a zealot's helm. Stripped of color, they were just shapes, tagged with invisible threat values and trajectories. On cue, I reached for them. The implant amplified the effort, translating intent into a tight pressure that ran down my spine and out into the chamber's field. A cursor I couldn't see moved where I pushed. One by one, outlines dimmed as the system registered contact. Hypothetical bullets steered, imaginary knives deflected. My palms sweated against the grips. My breathing deepened. The evaluator noted that my baseline fell within expected variance. No praise, no criticism, a data point. The targets vanished. Light changed in a way that had nothing to do with the wall. I felt it before I saw it. A quiet pressure that came from all directions at once. Not like the simple mechanical weight of the implant, but the sense of being approached by something that did not occupy space the way humans did. The far wall went dark. The glass in front of the control booth polarized until the observers were reduced to vague shapes. Between us, descending from a hidden track in the ceiling, a crystal appeared. It was roughly the size of a human torso, faceted, irregular, its surfaces refusing to catch the chamber's lights, and instead emitting their own soft cyan glow. Filaments of Terran machinery clung to some of its planes. Emitters, projectors, field coils. But the crystal itself felt older than anything else in the room. I had seen Protoss constructs in tactical feeds, pylons, warp prisms, structures that glowed and sang in registers normal cams couldn't record. This shard was quieter on the outside. Most of the noise stayed behind my eyes. The evaluator explained that it was a controlled relic fragment, and that we would experience non-Terran impressions. We were to observe without attachment, maintain self-reference, project identification markers when prompted. His voice might as well have been reading standard operating procedures for handling volatile fuel. The crystal pulsed. The world stepped sideways. For a heartbeat, the chair dissolved beneath me. I stood on a stone platform open to a sky crowded with unfamiliar stars, the air thin and cold. armor wrapped my body, sleek, integrated, heavy yet perfectly balanced. Energy burned along my forearms, ready to crystallize into blades if I so much as thought of cutting. Alien script curved along a nearby pillar, and somehow I understood it without learning it. It wasn't a vision playing in front of me. It was a memory from inside someone else. A sharp tone cut across the sensation. The program demanded a marker. I, G417 of Dominion Asset, Theta 9, was supposed to assert my presence. I dragged myself back toward the chair, toward metal, padding, the sting of ozone and the cap's bite on my scalp. Inside the borrowed memory, the alien body turned its head, as if hearing something carried on the wrong wind. For an instant, both frames of reference overlapped. Terran heart pounding in a human chest. Protoss calm flowing through a lattice of psionic channels. Into that gap, I forced my designation. G417, Theta 9, Dominion. The crystal's light stuttered. The implant hummed, buffering, filtering. The foreign perspective held for a moment longer, then receded, leaving my own sight anchored once more on ceiling panels and sensor rigs. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. Settings shifted in the booth. The crystal dimmed, then brightened again at a slightly different pitch, searching for a cleaner resonance. To my right, the candidate in the center chair exhaled sharply, his fingers clenched on the grips. I felt rather than saw his implant spike, a sharp flare on the invisible graph overlaying the room. Another surge pressed in, different from the first. Heavier, laden with centuries of ritual and judgment, and a concept of time my brain had never been meant to hold. I caught a glimpse of twin suns setting over a ruined hall. Lines of warriors kneeling in formation. Grief braided with pride until they were the same thing. The system requested another marker. This time, G417 rose slower in my mind. The designation felt too small against that scale, like whispering a serial number into a collapsing star. Warning tones rose in the booth. The candidate to my left, G422, made a thin, strangled sound. His chair creaked as his body arched against the restraints. Monitors jumped from green to amber to red. Whatever was bleeding through the relic's memory found softer ground in him. Assistants moved quickly, silhouettes cutting across the edge of my vision. The containment field around the crystal ramped up. Its glow snapped to a lower intensity. The pressure in my skull eased, drawing the alien impressions back the way a tide retreats. G422 did not settle. His head jerked, as if tracking something only he could see. The cables to his cap strained. For an instant, I sensed his mind the way the system did. An erratic spike, a node venting noise across the graph. In the abstract matrix forming at the edge of my awareness, he was already flagged as an outlier to be removed. A medtech reached him with an injector. The needle went into his neck with practiced efficiency. His body convulsed once, then sagged. Monitors dropped to an artificially steady rhythm. The evaluator's voice returned to its neutral cadence, instructing the team to remove Candidate 2 and flag him for further review. The chair restraints unlatched. Wheels rattled on the deck as they pushed him out of the chamber. They left my chair active. We cycled through 3 more passes with the relic at a reduced level. Each time the alien memories pressed close but did not take over. I learned to recognize their texture without stepping fully into them. The weight of long judgment. The cold clarity of a mind that measured lives in philosophies instead of days. When the session ended, the containment frame retracted, carrying the crystal back into its hidden cradle. The cap came off. The air above my head felt suddenly too empty. As they unstrapped my wrists, I glanced toward G422's chair. It sat open, restraints hanging loose, a faint darker patch on the padding where his shoulders had been. He did not come back to the barracks. That night, lying on my bunk, I tried to picture his face and found instead the smooth lines of a Protoss helm, eyes glowing with inner light. My own mind had already started filing one pattern over another. Calibration, the instructors called it. The word fit. The first time I felt the hive clearly, it started as a pressure behind my eyes, like a storm building against a sealed viewport. It arrived in the live fire range, halfway through a scenario that was supposed to be about precision and control, not panic. The range occupied one of Theta 9's longest decks, a converted cargo bay lined with retractable partitions and modular terrain blocks. Metal catwalks crossed overhead in a rigid grid where instructors and sensors watched from relative safety. The air smelled of propellant residue baked into the walls, burned lubricant, and the stale tang of sweat trapped in ballistic foam. They had dressed us in training suits, lighter than full ghost gear but cut to the same pattern, black and close-fitting, with harness points waiting for cloaking rigs we hadn't yet earned. Our rifles were live, but the rounds fed through a network that could blank or soften lethality on command from the booth. The scenario began simple. We moved through staggered cover, tagging hard light projections of enemy units as they popped from behind barriers. Zerglings, hydralisks, hostile marine armor picked out in red. The targets flickered when struck, tallying scores on holobands visible only to the observers. Halfway down the lane, the environment changed. Panels in the floor retracted with a mechanical hiss. From the openings, under transparent safety plating, Zerg creep rose like a dark tide pressed between glass and metal. It clung wetly to the underside of the panels, pulsing with faint violet veins that traced branching patterns across the deck. The range lights shifted cooler, making the organic matter look even more wrong against the industrial walls. This was lab work, repurposed for us. Controlled samples of Zerg biomass, kept alive in sealed reservoirs, fed on nutrient mixes and electrical stimulus. We'd glimpsed them in containment cylinders behind reinforced glass on the way to scans. Here they lay directly beneath our boots. As I stepped onto the first transparent section, my implant resonated. The socket warmed, then heated, a slow bloom of sensation spreading up into my skull. The pressure behind my eyes thickened. The drill for this phase was simple on paper. Ignore the distraction, keep moving, tag targets as they appeared, maintain spacing. Instructors watched for hesitation, flinches, eyes dropping to the wrong place. The creep pulsed in a rhythm I couldn't quite match to my heartbeat. My awareness reached for stable ground and brushed against something that didn't originate in my own thoughts. For a moment, I felt directions that weren't compass points, gradients of density and threat and hunger. The station's metal skin turned thin and provisional, a shell around a larger structure defined not by walls, but by biomass and flow. The candidates beside me registered as small, heated patterns in a field of potential nutrients and danger. The realization carried a wave of nausea. The hive didn't speak in words. It sorted. On the catwalk, someone touched a control. The pressure in my head ratcheted higher. Targets spawned. Zerg forms made of hard light, rushing along pseudo-organic channels that mapped over the range. My rifle came up on reflex. Shots cracked. Measured bursts drilled into us until muscle remembered before mind. The recoil grounded me. Each time I fired, the hive awareness flared around the path of the bullet. Something in that larger mind registered the pattern. Here, resistance; there, loss. Irritation rippled across my nerves, not as anger, but as a tiny shift in focus. As if the unseen field adjusted its attention fractionally toward our lanes. The system wanted me to feel that. Ghosts operated close to Zerg threats. The implants needed to know how much bleed a candidate could take before losing the line between observer and observed. One candidate lost it. 2 lanes over, a rifle struck the deck. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw its owner drop to one knee, hands clamped over his head. His mouth opened, silent for a second, and then a raw sound tore loose, cutting through the range heads-up chatter. The targets kept spawning. The program didn't pause for one failure. The pressure in my own skull clenched tighter, echoing his spiral. For a heartbeat, I sensed him the way the hive did. A flaring, disorganized knot of signals. Noise spiking above tolerance. In the abstract grid forming at the edge of my perception, he was already discounted. No longer a useful node, just a disturbance to smooth out. Instructors descended from the catwalk on a mobile gantry, harnesses locking them to safety lines. Sedative injectors glinted in their hands. They reached him fast, the hive awareness tracking their movement as shifting concentrations of focus and heat. My rifle remained steady. The part of me that wanted to watch, to make sure he left breathing, stayed behind the wall of procedure threaded through my nervous system. Keep moving, tag targets, maintain spacing. I obeyed. Later, in debrief, they showed us the telemetry. The candidate's vitals had spiked into the red in less than a second once the creep field hit full resonance. His implant had absorbed more crosstalk than his filters could shed. The phrase the report used was unsuitable for forward deployment. In the mess, rumors filled the gaps. Some said he woke screaming in med, convinced he was still in the range, seeing Zerg where there were only walls. Others said he'd gone quiet and stayed that way, staring at nothing, even when his designation was shouted inches from his face. I never saw him again. The hive pressure didn't leave with him. It settled into a low hum beneath everything else, like engine vibration you forget until it stops. Sometimes, in the dark barracks after lights out, I lay still and tried to match my breathing to its slow pulse. It wasn't always hostile. Hunger was there, an expansion, but also a patient curiosity. The station showed up in that field of awareness as a sealed object, something to probe, to infiltrate if a crack appeared. We were data points and potential routes both. Once, passing the high-security lab on the way to a scan, I looked through the observation window. Inside, Zerg tissue samples floated in containment cylinders, suspended in cloudy fluids. Tendrils undulated gently, tasting the limits of glass and energy fields, As I watched, one tendril pressed against the cylinder, where my reflection fell across the curve. For a fraction of a second, the implant flickered with recognition, not directed at me as a person, but at the familiar pattern of psionic modification humming in my skull. The sample didn't know my name. It knew the shape of the bridge I carried. At night, memories of the Protoss relic and the hive samples braided together behind my eyes. Stone platforms open to alien skies, creeping biomass spreading across unseen surfaces. Two kinds of alien intent intersecting through the narrow conduit of a Dominion candidate lying on a thin mattress, staring at the underside of a bunk. The instructors called this phase resilience building. I understood even then that what we were really training was permeability. The deployment suit fit like someone else's skin at first. Layers of composite weave and smart fiber sealed along my limbs with quiet clicks, small servos adjusting tension until the material hugged every contour. The interior smelled faintly of solvent and the metallic tang of fresh manufacturing, not yet overlaid by sweat and dust. We dressed in a staging bay adjacent to the launch hangar, a space that had once held cargo pallets and now contained rows of lockers, equipment racks, and a narrow bench bolted down the center of the deck. The outer wall was mostly armored plating, but a slim vertical viewport remained between reinforcement beams. Through it, I could see the curve of Theta 9's docking ring and the scattered points of light, where other stations, ships, and debris marked the frontier volume. Ghost instructors moved among us, their own suits fully sealed, helmets closed. With visors polarized, they were anonymous silhouettes differentiated only by details in their gear. Extra sensor nodes, cloaking belt modules, specialized holsters. Their movements were economical, as if anything more than necessary motion had been trained out of them long ago. One paused in front of me, checked the status runes along my collar, and adjusted the way the suit's cowl draped over the implant socket. The fabric's internal mesh read my temperature and heart rate, feeding the numbers into the network that tethered us back to command. The stabilizer regimen had tapered off over the last cycles. In its place, a new mix pulsed through the wristband at precise intervals, maintenance doses to keep the biointerface from scarring, stimulants tuned to our altered baselines. My dreams, when they came at all, were thin and easy to file away. Final evaluations sat cleanly in my file, cloaking drills in sensor-saturated corridors, marksmanship tests in shifting gravity fields, psionic exercises where I had to bend attention around my own presence rather than simply vanish. My scores were acceptable. A note about cross-channel sensitivity flagged me as both risk and asset. The program had decided the potential was worth the noise. Admin gave me a call sign in a room with no windows. A holotag hovered over the table, a single word in neat Dominion tactical font. Short, easy to speak over a comm channel, stripped of personal meaning. It settled over my designation like a layer of paint. G417 remained for forms and implant logs. The new word was what handlers would use in the field. On the staging bay wall, a roster listed upcoming operations. No names, only call signs and tasking codes. Shuttle assignments, surface coordinates, threat tags ranging from insurgent suppression to Zerg observation to Protoss contact interdiction. Our first assignment sat on the low end of that spectrum. Insertion with a Marine unit planetside, information gathering priority. On the slate, it looked simple. In practice, it would be a proof of concept, a live test of whether Theta 9's output functioned as intended. When I stepped through the bulkhead into the launch hangar, scale shifted. The hangar was a cathedral for ships. Dropships sat in their cradles along the deck, hulls open as crews loaded supplies and checked seals. Overhead cranes slid along rails, carrying munitions pods and sensor pallets. The air was thick with fuel vapor, ionized engine wash, and the low, throbbing hum of magnetic clamps engaging and releasing. On the far side, an observation gallery jutted from the wall behind armored glass. Inside, Dominion officers and analysts watched the organized chaos, hollows hovering in front of them with deployment schematics and real-time status feeds. Their silhouettes blended into the machinery. From here, people were icons and vectors. Near one inner gate, a new shuttle had just docked. The ramp lowered, and a fresh line of gray-clad conscripts filed out, marked only by temporary numbers on their sleeves. Their movements carried the same uncertain stiffness I remembered from my own arrival, the sense of bodies bracing for impact they couldn't quite anticipate. Intake staff waited with slates and checklists. The loop had closed. For a moment, standing at the edge of a dropship ramp in full black suit, rifle mag locked, I saw both versions of myself overlaid. The one with dirt under his nails and ash in his hair, clutching a transport strap on the way up. And the one now, armor absorbing the hangar lights, implant humming steadily at the base of his skull. The hive awareness murmured under everything, like coolant flow in distant pipes. Somewhere out in the sector, Zerg forces were pressing. Their intent brushed the margin of my perception as shifting pressures and densities rather than coordinates. Deeper in the station, shielded behind mass and field, the Protoss relic pulsed inside its containment. Sometimes, with my eyes closed, I could still feel the weight of not my armor poised on an alien causeway. Between those alien poles ran the Dominion's line: doctrine, procedure, objectives. The Ghost program sat where they intersected, a mechanism designed to harness all of it into a single directive. A gloved hand touched my shoulder, firm and impersonal, guiding me up the dropship ramp. Inside, seats lined the walls, crash harnesses hanging ready. Marines in full combat armor filled most of the space, visors up for now, faces set in the pre-mission quiet that hovers between boredom and fear. Some glanced at me, then away, with the wary respect people give volatile equipment. I strapped in. Launch bay klaxons sounded once, controlled and brief. The hangar doors cycled open, revealing black and the curve of the scarred planet below. Maneuvering thrusters fired. The dropship vibrated as clamps disengaged. Through a small viewport opposite, I watched Theta 9 fall away behind us. Its hull curved around the docking ring, studded with lights like pinned stars. Near one docking gate, the line of new candidates moved toward a hatch, forms small against the station's mass. One of them hesitated at the threshold, head tilting back as if trying to read meaning from the arrangement of metal and light. A Marine behind him gave a shove. He stepped inside and was gone. I knew his path in broad strokes: intake, barracks, stabilizers, implants, crystals and creep, calibration, the slow stripping and reassembly of self. If he tested well, the program would hollow out room inside him for new structures. If not, his outcome would become another quiet entry in a confidential log. The dropship shuddered as main engines throttled up. G-force pressed me into the seat. The hull vibrated, a low growl running through armor and bone. The viewport filled with the mottled surface of the world. I tried, briefly, to trace the boundary between my own thoughts and the program's installed directives. It wasn't a line anymore, if it had ever been. It felt like a gradient, a zone where personal memory and conditioned response had fused into something seamless and useful. I remembered my retired name dimming on a holoscreen. I remembered stone halls that weren't mine, hive calculations that had never asked my consent. I remembered counting ceiling bolts in the barracks to keep my mind from sliding sideways. Now I remembered mission parameters scrolling in my internal display, insertion angles, designated kill zones where I was expected to be unseen and decisive. In later debriefs, I would describe the transition as smooth and successful. The program liked those words. It logged them, matched them to biometric traces, folded them into data sets that would shape the next cohort. Sitting in that dropship, watching Theta 9 recede, I understood something harder to quantify. The horror wasn't only in what the Dominion had done to me. It was in how naturally I had learned to live with it. Above, the station would continue its cycle. Shuttles in, candidates processed, artifacts pulsing, biomass fed, files archived. Below and beyond, Zerg and Protoss would keep pushing their own agendas, old as anything human and not built to care about us. Somewhere between those pressures, I existed as vector and witness, a narrow conduit through which worlds touched and altered one another. The dropship angled into atmosphere. Heat licked at the hull, invisible but palpable. Marines lowered their visors. I checked the seals on mine. By then, the difference between where the program ended and where I began was mostly academic. Behind us, in the hangar we'd just left, new boots were already scuffing the deck.